All right, I'm here alongside the Sultan of Sonar, Zach Strickland. What do we have today, sir?
Yeah, so I've got our outbound tender volume index paired with the outbound tender rejection index just to show and illustrate how demand has stayed strong in relation to tender rejection rates over the last 3 months or so. So we've got our outbound tender rejection rate here in the blue line, and you can see this little wavy undulation thing. That's the July 4th, end of June, then you got Memorial Day right here, and then way back there in April, we had high rejection rates, relatively speaking, about 26% at the start of this chart. So come all the way down to 21.7% over the last 3 months. But if you look at our tender volume index, it's actually come up in the last 3 months. So demand is actually increased while the rejection rates have come down, meaning that there's more freight moving under contracted load.
Right, it's a way to look at it from the inverse, the accepted tender volume index is actually maybe its highest than it's ever been right now.
Exactly. So there's a ton of freight still moving out there. Even though we're seeing spot market rates, or spot market volumes, I should say, kind of come down and ease a little bit, but spot market rates still very elevated. Tender rejection rate of 21.7% is still extremely elevated. Like we're not just because it's come down from 26% does not mean that the market is now back to normal.
Right, more than enough pressure to keep up on spot rates, keep up on the entire market, right?
Exactly. So let's look at the capacity trend map first. Go ahead and see where the tightest markets in the country are. We talked about this a little yesterday. Some of the tightest spots in the country continue to be in these big markets. You've got Atlanta, Ontario, Los Angeles out there, and then up here around Chicago, but not quite Chicago, because Chicago's in white there. That means that is a much looser market than these darker blues that are sitting just to the south of it here in Joliet. And we talked about the rail congestion and things like that out of LA causing UP to suspend service coming into Chicago while they get a lot of those containers offloaded. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to transition to truckload right away. There's a lot of drayage going on. They got to go into warehouses, then get onto the trucks, et cetera. So it's, when we're talking about international container volumes, it's very different than the domestic side.
Right.
It takes a little bit of transition, a little bit of work to get it there. So we do expect, however, to see a little bit more activity out of the Chicago area. We already see it. The railheads are just sitting out here in the southern side of Chicago, southwest, I should say. That's really where a lot of this dark blue activity is right now. But my concern this week and the last little bit has been in the south. So let's pull up the weighted rejection index map and see why. So we've had a lot of crazy, elevated rejection rates in the south. Atlanta, obviously the biggest single market in the United States, and we've had all this activity here over the last few months because of this little blue area right here around Savannah. So Savannah is in blue again for the weighted rejection index. And the weighted rejection index is simply something that tells us the most relevant week over week changes in the tender rejection rate or capacity. So anything in blue indicates tightening, anything in red indicates loosening week over week. It doesn't mean that it's loose. That's what that capacity trend score map was for. That's to tell you whether things are actually tight or loose. This is to tell you week over week change, direction, what's the most important thing to look at. Maybe I was operating out of Atlanta last week and it was super tight. Things have loosened a little bit. Not a lot, but a little bit because it's in orange. But Savannah, this is interesting to me. Savannah's starting to tighten back up again after having a pretty significant loosening segment.
Yeah, have you seen, if we looked at the volumes coming in from the ports, do we think this is just the unabating imports through the Port of Savannah?
So ports are very interesting in the way that it takes a little bit of time for that freight to transition, and Savannah has been extremely erratic. We saw a huge loosening in Savannah there right before the holiday. Tender rejection rates dropping from 45% all the way down to 30%, but they are back on their way up a little bit. So if we go into our charts, where I wanted to highlight a few of these markets, first up Atlanta. Atlanta here, got our tender rejection rate, tender volume situation here. This market is extremely important to the South. So as Atlanta goes, so does the South. Right. Southern capacity, of course, is very pivotal on this market right here. So tender volumes out of Atlanta actually, somewhat erratic if you look at this chart. You've got a lot of peaks and valleys here. The holidays really make it a little bit more difficult to look at, but still, ignoring the holidays, you still have a lot of volatility here. And tender rejection rates, of course, highest they've ever been in Atlanta right before July 4th, et cetera. So, but volumes are starting to come down out of Atlanta. I don't know if that's really going to sustain, but they are starting to fall a little bit. Tender rejection rates hovering right around 23% right now. Very low considering we were just at 31%.
Right. I was going to say that we see volumes coming down here, but if we probably expanded this map to a 6 month, even a year and a half, you're going to see the volumes are extremely elevated, right?
Exactly. So the scale's kind of playing games with you a little bit, but at the same time, we are looking like we're in somewhat of an easing pattern for the moment, but it's extremely difficult to try to chart this out for the future because of all of this huge undulation in volume and tender rejection rate.
Yeah, Donnie Gilbert has given his expectations of kind of down and to the right, but also high at the end of the month, kind of this undulation where we peak, or we trough in the middle of the month and peak towards the end of the month. Zach, thanks so much for the insight. We'll be back with him a little bit later in the show.